Psychiatrists of Reddit, have you ever had a patient that genuinely scared you? If so, why? Story 1. Psychiatrist here. Yes, but it's rare. The vast majority of times were very agitated patients that were extremely ill in an inpatient psych unit. None of them had the intention to harm me. None of them harmed me physically. The odds of being harmed are exponentially higher as a person with mental illness as compared to the odds of being harmed by someone with mental illness. I can't imagine the fear most hospitalized patients are feeling, stuck inside a disturbed mind in a locked unit. Every time I felt scared, it was brief, and followed by grief over how distressing it must be to experience that level of psychological distress. There was one person in the clinic that scared me, but he was kind of just puffing out his chest and trying to flaunt. I haven't worked with antisocial patients much, with a few exceptions, but that is some scary crap. Story 2. Not me, but my mom. She worked at an elementary school for some time that had a lot of very troubled kids. She dealt with bullied and abused kids every day, but there was one that had rattled her to her core. There was a young girl who lived with her grandmother. Her parents were no longer in the picture. She had obvious signs of schizophrenia, which the grandmother didn't fully understand or accept. My mom helped the girl the best she could, teaching her how to handle the voices in her and helped her through a few psychotic breaks. One day, the girl comes in and explains that the voices told her to kill the newborn puppies in the barn. She went into great detail, telling my mom how she ended the puppies and cleaned herself up. My mom didn't believe her until she called the grandmother, who stated, very matter of factly, "Yep, she got to them." As far as I know, the girl never got treatment for the mental illness, even with my mom's insistence. My mom left, and I have no idea what happened to that girl. Story 3. Did some work as a psychologist in a jail for young adults, age 18 to 24. There was this one boy who actually got me paranoid for a couple of weeks. He was only 18, but had already committed murder for his street gang. He was always very loud and tried to be as cool and intimidating as he could whilst in group, but one on one, he was always a lot easier. Sessions with him were usually quite boring and stale until one day he, very calmly, told me my address and threatened to hurt my family. Work usually didn't follow me home, but that got me paranoid for a good few weeks. Story 4. Psychiatrist here. I've encountered several. The scary ones are those that are floridly psychotic, have a history of attacking people unprovoked and causing serious injuries, and have absolutely zero insight into their condition. The most memorable incident was when a patient of mine, easily 300 pounds over 6 feet, threatened to kill me for keeping him on the unit against his will. He picked up a chair and tried to break through the glass of the nursing station, broke a security officer's jaw, and knocked another one unconscious. He eventually was taken down by 10 plus security officers, all while making eye contact with me and screaming that he would kill me. Crazy crap. Story 5. I was given a new case, a man in his early 50s who was living in a hostel at the time. I went out to introduce myself, and I knew immediately he was seriously unwell. I spoke with the support staff at his accommodation, and we decided it would be best to get him assessed by his psychiatrist as soon as possible. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, but was also a heavy heroin and crack user. In the UK, unfortunately, people with mental health issues who are also active users are often turned away in times of mental crisis, as it is considered impossible to assess what is surreal and what can be attributed to drug use. The man had a real fear of emergency services. If you call an ambulance in these situations, the police also attend as mandatory, so it was decided I would escort him in a taxi. Our lone worker policy stated I had to sit in the back of the vehicle with him. About halfway through the journey, he starts getting very agitated and shouting that he knows who I am now. I'm Florence Nightingale, and I abused him as a child, and I now need to be punished for it. He talked about how he had to stab Florence to get rid of all the evil inside him. He was very fragile, only around 5'2", and was severely underweight. But I was terrified nonetheless. It was the look in his eyes. I knew that he truly was frightened and absolutely believed what he was saying. I was not only frightened for my safety, but it was also so frightening to see just how warped and out of touch the human mind can actually become. Very sad all round. He was a lovely man. Story 6. W animal deaths and DV. I'm a paralegal, and one of our clients was sent to a psychologist as part of his claim for personal injury. He said that the accident had caused psych symptoms, which isn't unusual. The report we got back said never to send him to her again, and that she found it comfortable to be in the same room as him. Turns out he'd end his dog for damaging the sofa and had beaten his wife in a hotel room. He'd also followed random strangers home from supermarkets if he thought they had been rude to him, and had considered hurting a baby as it was annoying him by crying. He said none of that was normal for him, and he'd changed since the accident. Didn't believe him in the slightest, and wondered how much of it was actually a load of crap. Still scary, and he wasn't allowed to visit our offices. Story 7. I was on the other side as a patient that freaked out the psych. I needed therapy. I felt like I was losing myself and that I could end up killing one person. I would spend my whole day playing it in my head how and when. The idea of going to prison was nothing compared to the relief of killing that person. Sometimes I would get a strong, sudden urge with random opportunities, and I would have to contain myself, not to act upon those. I knew it was bad, so I asked for therapy ASAP and got the strength to tell my therapist about my thoughts after a couple attempts. He got clearly scared, and I stopped seeing him. Story 8. Am a psychiatrist. I've always felt safest working inpatient because even if the patients may have psychosis, the staff and environment is much better set up to handle it. In the last few years, I've only really been unnerved when I saw a guy in clinic who demanded an inappropriate dose of Adderall and refused to take any alternative as an answer. Dude just kind of wouldn't leave the office, and I had to get up and open the door for him. He was clearly pissed off, had access to firearms, and was an impulsive guy. That was over a year ago and nothing came of it, but yeah. Story 9. Therapist in training and my tutor, who is a childhood abuse and trauma specialist, tells some horror stories. The one that stood out for this question was a guy in his mid 40s who had lived most of his life with extreme paranoia that his parents were sending people to get information from him to blackmail him. This guy was extremely unstable and was legally obligated to go to therapy after committing some petty theft because he believed his parents were tracking his money. Anyway, he'd been going for about 6 weeks, and he began to talk about a plan for the future. He was kind of vague, but said he had worked out a way to break free from his childhood and move forward. My tutor was apprehensive but hopeful. He had been making good progress in the previous sessions. Fast forward a week, and this guy is back again. He's noticeably agitated and carrying a large sports bag. My tutor remarks that she's pleased to see him and likes his new bag. He breaks down. He confesses that he has a machete in the bag and had planned to kill everyone from his old life, starting with his therapist so he could be free from his past, but she was very nice and would be hard to kill. My tutor politely excused herself and called the police. The guy was very compliant. He'd pretty much given up at that point, but the police confirmed he did indeed have a large machete in his bag, and his car was full of bin bags. She said that was the only time she felt she was close to dying, and says, the moral of the story is to treat all your clients well, because you never know who's plotting your assassination. Story 10. Once when I was a medical student, I was asked to see a patient in the psychiatric unit of the emergency room. I walked in with my short white coat and clipboard and asked the guy what brought him in today and what was wrong. He looked me dead in the eyes with foamy saliva dribbling from the corner of his mouth and a strange smell in the air and said, "The devil told me to kill you and kill myself." He was sweaty and his eyes were bloodshot and his wife beater had dark red and brown stains on it. The door was behind him, and I wasn't sure I could make it there before something bad happened. No idea if he had a weapon on him. Was afraid of calling loudly for help. I was in a quiet corner of the ER, and I felt like I would have had to yell to get attention, and I didn't want to startle him. I stayed there for a half hour and asked him more questions. Slipped out when he started to look sleepy. Story 11. I'm a therapist, but not a psychologist, if that matters. I used to work in a facility for kids and adolescents with pretty intense behavioral issues. Even when a client was aggressive, I was usually able to de-escalate them, and I generally didn't feel unsafe. In fact, most of the time I was concerned about their safety during outbursts. With one exception, I had a client that was pretty strong and prone to intense tantruming. This client was acting in a way that was unsafe, had a plan to seriously hurt another resident, I think. So I had to put them on restriction within staff eyesight at all times. Their response was to run up to me and attempt to choke me. Luckily, the staff got there in time and prevented this kid from seriously hurting me. On another occasion, this same client also took apart their curtain rod in their bedroom and swung it at my head. I dodged in time. Oddly enough, this client and I had a pretty good relationship the other 99% of the time, and I generally enjoyed working with them. Story 12. A very sweet, mostly blind teenager who was going through his first psychotic break and had a love of martial arts. Taekwondo, if I remember correctly. Was really, really, really good at it. He couldn't see and would practice kicks, and at one point, accidentally kicked one of the reinforced, shatterproof windows in the quiet room. Think padded room without the padding. Turns out they were shatter resistant. He destroyed it with that kick. Why those particular details? Because he would practice his kicks everywhere. Was mostly blind, and the one time he flipped up to practice one and I was walking around the corner, it came literal centimeters from my face, and I felt the impact of it against the air, like a physical force bashing into my face. Sweetest kid in the world. He would have been horrified if it had, because things would have broken. A lot of things. He also grabbed my arm once in a sudden firm grasp and asked if I wanted to do taekwondo with him. No. No, I did not. Story 13. Had a client years ago who had recently gotten out of prison for assaulting a police officer pretty badly. The client had a volatile temper and lived in a violent family growing up. The client never got angry with me personally. However, while talking about their family and other people in their life, the client would get so worked up with anger that I sometimes wondered if I was safe. I started pretending to be on emergency call duty in the clinic where I worked so that I had an excuse to carry a walkie-talkie with me during our sessions. Shortly after I began doing that, I terminated the therapeutic relationship and referred the client for a completely different type of treatment than what I provided. The last I heard, the new treatment method was helping the client. Story 14, I work with special needs populations, all of whom come to us via referral. So when I have someone whose mother starts off by saying, the school is misunderstanding her teenager, I know I'm in for something more interesting. This kid was 16. He was obsessed with several people who had been nice to him at various times. He considered them his best friends and had an entire inner world of how ride and die they were for each other. In the major case, he hadn't spoken to the other boy in 2 years since they had stopped doing scouting together. Patient had heard a school rumor that his best friend's girlfriend had cheated on him with another kid and proceeded to pour kerosene on the girl's car while she was in it and tried to set it on fire. Story 15. My brother-in-law is low-functioning autistic and blind. At one point, his care provider, who had worked with him for years and knew him quite well, got into a very dangerous situation with him. She had worked with him since he was smaller and had become experienced at interacting safely when he would become angry and aggressive. They had found a good balance of medication for him, and she let her guard down. This time, though, he was now 20 years old and 6 feet tall. In a split second, he attacked her, jumping up from the couch directly across from her chair. He was very strong and viciously aggressive. I have found myself in tough situations with him, and I'm 6'4", 225 pounds. After receiving quite a few blows from his hands, hair torn out, and bites on her arms and hands, she was able to push away across the ground and get behind the couch he had been sitting on. She quickly slid the couch into a corner so that he wouldn't have a way around it easily, and she hid herself behind it and tried to be very quiet. He searched that corner of the room for over an hour, following the front and side edges of the couch with his hands, back and forth pacing until he eventually lost interest and went to play with some toys off in the corner of the room. She got out of the corner and ran for her door just as her assistant was coming to remind her that she had gone over the allotted time. My BIL is an amazing guy, and I've had some awesome experiences with him over the years, but the idea of being hunted by sound like that is pretty freaky. Story 16. Not a psychologist, but saw a breakdown in my ex that scared me senseless. He had just started meds, and the meds reacted horribly with him for whatever reason. He mostly had hallucinations, but sometimes he'd black out and do activities and not remember them. He would call me screaming at 3 a.m., and he didn't remember a second of it, any of it. He had hallucinations before, but they got increasingly dangerous with these meds. In particular, I think of one instance. While on the phone during an episode, he said, I boiled some water. I asked why, as it was 3 a.m., and he replied eerily calmly, they told me I have to stick my hand in here. It was absolutely terrifying. I finally begged him to go to the hospital that following morning to ask for a medication change, and he begrudgingly obliged. While he was there, he started throwing up blood and had to get his stomach pumped. Turns out, in one of his blackouts, he swallowed his entire bottle of medication. Story 17. I'm not a psychologist, but I have 2 psych degrees and have been in and out of psychiatric wards since my late teens. For 14 years, I worked with adults with developmental disabilities. So, as you can imagine, I've seen my fair share of frightening behavior. But nothing scared me more than nannying for a 5-year-old boy with autism and a mood disorder. He had just been released from the hospital where he had stayed for a month to get acclimated to behavioral meds. But in the short 2 weeks I nannied for him, I feared for my life. He would kick, bite, scratch, hit, spit, come after me with knives, punch cars, scream loud enough for neighbors to think he was being abused, and destroy his mother's picture perfect apartment. And when I tried to tell his mom that he needed more help than a babysitter could give him, she fired me, saying I was wrong and that he just needs someone more attentive. Complete denial. Story 18. Was a drug and alcohol counselor for a while, not a psychologist. Had a client who I didn't make good progress with, and there was always something off. I sometimes ran into him at a local bar where he wasn't supposed to be. He was a court ordered referral, and staying out of places like that was part of his treatment plan. I say this because it meant he learned one of the places where I socialized sometimes. Anyway, stories he told me about weekends when he'd traveled away from that small town often hinted at raping women. He'd say things about how she said she didn't like me, but she was really just joking and flirting. Anyway, I found a way to control her so she wanted him. I wasn't able to pull enough detail to be positive or to gather any actual identifying information, such as exactly where he'd traveled to or what the girl's name was, but this happened several times. He was vague enough to be both scary and beyond reach. Eventually, he was moving away from the area, and at his last appointment with me, he hinted that we could throw down and he would get his money's worth out of it. I watched over my shoulder until I was certain he was moved for good. Story 19. Master's level psychotherapist here. Was doing anger management with a young person, 19 to 20 years old, on probation for domestic assault. When we were talking about the situation and what happened, he said, "My girlfriend had a smart mouth, so I punched her in it, her mouth." I was talking to his probation agent later about his cold demeanor, and he told me to watch him closely. Suggested verbatim that he could be the next Ted Bundy. This was a PO that usually didn't get involved with the treatment program unless his probationers were really high risk. His words had me spooked. Kid violated probation quickly and was sentenced to a few more years, which we all thought was fine by us. He was creepy. Story 20. Also not a psychiatrist, but I worked in a facility for senior health, basically a medication adjustment unit for people 55 plus mental health patients, or psych ward. I worked overnight in my early 20s, and all of the lights were off except the nurse's station, so that alone was eerie. It was always 2 RNs and 1 CNA, me. I did 30-minute checks throughout the night, but we had one admit that had lost her marbles and was brought in by a Native American family with not a lot of hospital background or diagnosis information to even go off of. This 60-something-year-old Native American woman had bed sores so bad they tunneled throughout her buttocks, back, heels, everywhere from neglect, babbled like a baby, saw things and reached for them when there was nothing there, scratched at herself, cackled at high volumes throughout the night, looked blankly into space, hooked nose into her hands, then looked at it before sucking it back up. Just typing this, remembering. Seeing it makes me want to puke. Was nonverbal, and you couldn't get her to understand almost anything. Anyway, after a few weeks and the family never really taking her to the doctor, so we had to order lots of tests to see what's up, etc. Come to find out, this poor lady could have been normal if the family had just cared and taken her in a lot sooner or brought her to the doctor. Syphilis had gone on so long inside of her, it pretty much destroyed her brain to the point of no return. She went crazy from a curable STI. Story 21. Good friend of mine's wife is a psychologist at a well-known prison and sees some seriously messed up people for a living. Let's just say Hannibal inspired her to do what she does for a living, and she's as close to Clarice as a person can probably get in real life. She is usually briefed on relevant details before she is assigned to a case. This includes court proceedings, testimonies, etc. She's heard recordings of assassinations and other such disturbing crap. She's tough as nails, and I guess she loves psychoanalyzing scary psychos. She had to be taken off a case because she was so uneasy, disturbed, and threatened by one of her clients. Apparently, this guy was an assassination. She couldn't give lots of details, but he has a victim profile and she fits it. He started to behave strangely towards her, trying to converse with her and get to know her. He would write her letters and draw her pictures and attempt to give her tokens and things. All the things he would do to his victims, well, everything possible under the circumstance. She was so upset and disturbed by his special attention that she was even afraid at the grocery store and started to feel uneasy in her home at night, despite the fact that this guy was locked up in a maximum security prison. She described it like a hunter or prey vibe on a really weird animalistic level. She was taken off his case and received counseling. When she told me about it, she was very honest and matter of fact. This is a hazard of the job she works. While she may talk about her patients as if they are lab rats, This was one case you could tell really got under her skin and spooked her.